Let's ask Benedict Spence. Benedict, I want you to put your psychologist hat on this morning. Very good morning to you. What is possibly going on inside between the ears of Keir Starmer and his brain?
I mean, I think that's a very unfair question for you to put to me because I don't have half an hour to explain to you how many different ways, not very much, can be going on inside somebody's brain.
Yeah.
Honestly, because yeah, it's for a very long time one just sort of assumed it was the old joke about the monkey with the symbols just doing that. Because honestly, he seemed to be so completely out of tune with the rest of the country in terms of what it is that they actually wanted and what he was planning on delivering. But I can sort of understand why he is in panic mode. And obviously, when people are in panic mode, they do things that aren't very sensible. But by sort of talking incessantly about Nigel Farage, he is obviously giving him free airtime every time he mentions him. That sort of classic thing of going, "Oh no, I'm not bothered at all by this person who I'm just going to mention, ad nauseam." It's a tricky thing though for Starmer because in many ways he's sort of got a point in that Farage has got absolutely no experience of ever running anything, and that actually he's not putting out sort of the best policy platform that's sort of covering all bases. But the point, of course, that Farage would make, if anybody were to ask him, was, and he was being honest, well, why would I need any of that?
Right.
Ultimately, I exist here and I'm doing so well here because all the things Keir Starmer is accusing me of and all the things the Tories are accusing me of, well, they already have a really good track record of, or, crashing the economy, not being responsible, this, that, and the other. Well, it's the two established parties that have actually led Britain to a pretty disastrous economic situation. Why should we care about Nigel Farage's track record, even though he doesn't have one? By definition, that's not as bad as Labour's or the Conservatives.
Yeah, and again, they haven't learned anything from the United States of America because this is what they tried on Trump back in 2016 when they said, here's a guy who's never worked in government. He doesn't know how government works. He doesn't understand it. He'll run it into the ground. It'll be awful. And of course, that's precisely why people wanted him in, because they know what the uni party, as reform voters call it, have done to this country. 14 years of Tories. Before that, sort of 13 years or so of Labour, and before that another sort of 18 years of the Tories. We've just had one disaster really after another, occasionally sort of punctuated by periods of wealth and periods of good times. But I can't remember ever walking around this sceptred isle of ours thinking, what a great government we've got. I'm so happy that they're leading the country so well and stewarding us into a bright new future. I don't remember ever saying that, do you?
No, and I mean that's the thing, isn't it? When politicians turn around and say, "Well, reform Nigel Farage," they don't know how government works. The voters turn around and go, "But that's the point; it doesn't work."
Yeah.
And even if Farage himself doesn't have experience of this, I tell you what, he has a lot of people, a lot of friends in the business world who are going to be more than capable of sort of coming in if he so chooses,
Yeah.
in the event that he's able to form a government, who might in fact have a slightly different view on how to run the country than career politicians. And I think that that's the really important thing to remember here. For as many, opportunities that Labour and the Tory states say, oh, well, we have this MP and they tick this diversity box and we have this one that ticks that diversity box. Actually, what there is a real lack of, and has been for some time, is people with real world experience. And I don't mean people who work down a coal mine or anything like that, but people with tangible experience of running complex systems, running large organizations. Neither party really has that.
No, exactly right. And I mean, Nigel Farage is calling this Project Fear 2.0, which I think is also right, because again, Starmer and his crowd haven't learned from the Brexit experience, where, if you go around telling everybody that if we leave the European Union, it's all going to be a disaster, it's only bigots who want to do it, you must be racist if you want to leave this wonderful place that is the continent of Europe, that didn't work, and this won't work either.
No, it won't. And again, it's that sense of, well, whatever it is that you say Farage will do, look at where you have already led us. We want something different. And even if it is an unknown, this is the key thing. And it's such a disaster that our politicians haven't recognized this. If you push people to a point, they will be prepared to take the unknown over what they currently have. And that's the thing. Whatever it is Labour are currently offering, people are going to reject it en masse at the next general election on the current trajectory, just like they rejected the Tories. And you can cry all you want about Farage and about he's a bigot and this, that, and the other. People have heard it now for 15 years.
Yeah.
They're tired of it. They're completely inoculated against it. It's not going to work.
Exactly right. Let's just have a look at some of the questions that were put to Starmer yesterday, because The Guardian turned on him, the BBC turned on him, Sky turned on him. All of his usual kind of allies who would normally be teeing up him to be able to destroy Nigel Farage with the answer, said all of this. Have a look.
Do you think one of the problems is that Nigel Farage can approximate talking like a human being, where you just resort to talking points and dodging questions.
The speed of the decline in your popularity is historically unprecedented. Isn't this speech today an admission that you have failed and Nigel Farage understands voters better than you?
Nigel Farage has 5 MPs, you've got 403. Are you panicking because Reform is so far ahead in the polls, it seems? Is he living rent-free in your brain? You went to a state school, your dad worked in a factory, your mum worked in the NHS, so why has a public school-educated former city trader got more in common with the Red Wall than you have?
Reform UK say you're running scared of them, that you're sounding increasingly like them with some of the policies and announcements you've made recently. This is a speech that was very defensive, wasn't it? Are you not worried people will ask why you're holding a press conference about Nigel Farage 4 years out from a general election instead of focusing on your plans for the country?
You went into the election promising to freeze national insurance and keep the two-child benefit cap. You've since raised national insurance on businesses and now you're considering axing the cap. Isn't attacking Nigel Farage's economic credibility a bit rich?
And he's standing there like a man without any kind of country to hold on to. And somebody pointed out that even his folded up, his rolled up sleeves are not rolled up sleeves, they're actually folded up sleeves and ironed, folded up. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it?
That's the sort of thing that's going on in his brain. I've got to look normal, he says, as he gets someone to iron his sleeves. I mean, the thing is, with the media beginning to turn on him, there are two aspects to this. The first is that even if they are ideologically driven, a lot of journalists, a lot of lobby journalists, what they actually really love is the show. They love the circus, they love the hysteria. They loved it when the Tories were in power and everything was going wrong, because it meant that there was more stuff for them to rail against. Even though we all knew that most of them were not ideologically very sympathetic to the Tories, they were absolutely delighted when the Tories were in power, because it meant stories, it meant chaos, it meant scandal. And, you know, as much as a journalist might be politically motivated, ultimately what they like is the story. There is another element to this as well, though, and it's interesting that it's happening quite so early, which is that you see them turning personally on Starmer, but it's not necessarily turning on the Labour government. And that's because, of course, I think we're beginning to hear the rumblings behind the scenes. Angela Rayner's name, for some reason, keeps on being mentioned, that there is a lot of unhappiness with Starmer, and that there is a possibility that some MPs might try to unseat him. Now, that doesn't tend to happen in the Labour Party. If it is going to happen, I think it would need quite a bit of momentum, quite a bit of a push. And so I think you can see there why journalists might be happy, if you like, to turn on him quite aggressively, because they understand, as well as his MPs understand, if you are going to make that change, it's going to take quite the heave, and I think that they will have to play their part in that.
I think so, but I think they clearly smell blood in the water, because I've never seen them all turn collectively like that quite as quickly, if you like.
Yeah, and again, there is the sense of the pack with the lobby. There always has been, and it's a very difficult one, because I think a lot of lobby journalists like to think that they sort of lead the agenda, that they're at the forefront and that they have the power to bring down prime ministers and governments, whereas in fact I think it's actually the opposite. You know, they're doing this now, they feel empowered to do this now because of where Reform are and how bad the government are already doing, because as you say, a couple of weeks ago, you know, they were still polling quite badly and there wasn't this sort of aggression, but it's only now that those stories have started to emerge and people are starting to say, you know, properly, could there in fact be an alternative? Does there need to be an alternative? That I think that, I don't want to call them tame journalists, but we all understand the sort of the established journalists feel confident enough to go, this might be the moment to start pushing.
Yeah, exactly right. And when you see Lord Hermer in the papers this morning, you realise how out of touch actually this government is, because Lord Hermer, another mate of Keir Starmer's, who was appointed to the role of Attorney General, who should have been kicked out last year when it turned out that he was a bit too close to certain clients that he had worked with in the past, who might have been, shall we say, slightly anti-British, and he had a very dodgy role in the kind of whole selling off of the Chagos Islands, which again this morning Keir Starmer's being asked to apologise for, because he said China was against the deal. Turns out China have said, actually, we really like the deal, we think it's great for us. But Hermer basically telling everyone that if you want to leave the ECHR, you're a bit like a Nazi.
Yeah, but of course, everyone who disagrees with anybody in the Labour Party is a bit like a Nazi, and they'll always find ways of being able to say, you know, that there's something a bit fascist about everyone who disagrees with them. The problem is, you know, leaving the ECHR would be a very difficult and complex process, and it is sort of being a bit thrown around quite willy-nilly at the moment. It would need to be replaced with something else, and my fear with it is, well, look at the current state of our political system, our politicians, the lawyers in our politics. Would you actually trust these ones to come up with a better alternative than the ECHR? It might be very imperfect and written for a different era. I do think that it's out of date and not fit for purpose, but have we actually seen anything from any other political party that could stand up to the scrutiny? I would argue we've not yet seen that, because I think a lot of politicians, and particularly I'm talking about the Tories here, have not quite cottoned on to the fact of how important this legislation is, how much of an outsized role it plays in our politics. I think Reform have cottoned on to it, absolutely, but I'm not sure they quite yet, because of course we're still talking about a party that's not won anything. I don't think that it's yet in a position where it can campaign on saying, well, we need to leave the ECHR, because a lot of people will go, please just stick to migration, stick to one thing at a time. Let's not stop other referendums. That's going to be a bit too divisive. Get through the door first.
But I've always said there's no necessity to leave the actual ECHR, and make a big deal out of it. Just start ignoring it, which is what an awful lot of other European countries do. You just don't pay any attention to it, and take out Article 8 and just say, on this specific situation with deportation of criminals, it will not apply because you are a dangerous person and you're not welcome in this country, and so therefore you do not have the right to apply to stay under the human rights laws. And you could easily do that without having to have the whole rigmarole of walking away from something and tearing it up and inventing something else.
I mean, well, you're absolutely right. We could do that, which is, as you say, what most European countries do. But equally, the same argument could have been made about our membership of the European Union. For some reason, we were almost alone amongst all the countries in the EU who said absolutely everything that Brussels says has to be taken literally and at its word, and we sort of have to bow and kowtow and do everything they say. Every other country kind of went, yes, we like the overall idea of this, but every now and then there will be something that we don't like, and we will ignore it, and we'll take the little slap on the wrist that Brussels gives us later. There was always that interpretation, at least before Brexit. I think it's hardened since then. But you do sort of sense that if we had been a little bit less literal about the interpretation of some of these laws, like our European colleagues, we might conceivably still be in Europe. And you're right, when it comes to the ECHR, we could just ignore a lot of these things and do what other countries go, which is the fine is probably less than the cost of enforcing the legislation. That's usually the case. We don't seem to get that, though.
Yeah, exactly right. Very good to speak to you. Benedict Spence, thank you very much indeed. Political commentator there on what it is that we have to do differently to every other country in Europe. I don't understand. I never did understand why it had to be like that.